This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?
And sponsored by Uber Creative Agency, a boutique web design, development, and marketing agency based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with clients across the U.S. We don't just provide services, we deliver value.
Welcome to the Lake Superior Podcast. I'm Walt, Lindala.
And I'm Frida, Waara. We are made stronger by story, and there's no better source than the continent's largest body of fresh water, Lake Superior.
So join us as we highlight the 5 national parks that ring this greatest of the Great Lakes, meet the people, tour the places, and learn about the projects that make these parks and body of water so remarkable.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
Welcome once again. I'm Walt Lindala.
And I'm Frida Waara.
To the Lake Superior Podcast. A good one today, Frida.
Oh, you know, Walt, you and I love to volunteer. We are so involved in our community. And I just started my apprenticeship as a tour guide at the Marquette Maritime Museum. And we're going to be they're going to be doing some painting up there. So we're going to get an opportunity now to go up in the tower to give those tours. But
at the Lighthouse.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Lighthouses are so fascinating to me. Have you been around them much?
I've been around them, but I have to say I don't have a lot of really in-depth experience with them. No, I mean, I'm very familiar with them, especially in Marquette and along the Great Lakes, but don't have a lot, no.
Well, remember a few weeks back when we talked with Dave Girth about the Rock of Ages Lighthouse and the renovation?
Yes.
Oh, boy. I mean, it's really something. And I did a little lighthouse research. So Michigan, because we're circled by the Great Lakes. We got our feet in 4 out of the 5. We have 247 lighthouses that have been on our shoreline. Now, about 100 of those are still in good condition, and I think you can probably visit maybe a good 50% of those now. Mm-hmm. And out of the 78 lighthouses, I saw that number on Lake Superior. I also did see that there were 56 lighthouses on the Lake Superior tour. So that would include 3 states and the province of Ontario on that tour. Mm-hmm. Michigan has 42 of those. So that's pretty cool.
So one of the things that we like to talk about here on the Lake Superior Podcast is areas along the Lake Superior National Parks. And the greatest concentration of lighthouses on our Lake Superior National Parks is at the Apostle Islands. Today, we get to talk with Fred Schlichting, who lives just north of Bayfield, Wisconsin in Cornucopia. And he is a ranger at the Apostles, also a lighthouse historian. This should be a lot of fun. Welcome, Fred, to the podcast.
Glad to be with you today.
I got to ask you right off the bat, how did you get into working at the Apostles? Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, it started a while ago, really, because I was actually a volunteer. My career was not working for the park or having anything to do with this park, but my career was in public education. I spent 40 years as a teacher and a school administrator. But my wife was a seasonal ranger for this park for over 30 years. And a number of years ago, she said, Brett, we desperately need some volunteers, and especially emergency volunteers who could come out, do a couple days at one of the island sites, including the lighthouses, to volunteer when somebody is taken off for an emergency. Can you do that? You can use some of your vacation time. I said, yes, I will do that. And so I started working. Through probably about 15 years that I volunteered, I worked at most of the sites, including the lighthouses. And I thought, I really love this. So when I retired, I applied for a park ranger position here at Apostles. I had been eyeing up the site at the ranger at Raspberry Island. I got the job, and this will be my 11th season working for the Apostles.
The Apostles are fairly unique in the sense that it has a distinction of Superior's largest collection of lighthouses. How did that come to be? What was going on in our history? What can you tell us about that?
Well, first of all, yes, we have the largest collection, but it's the largest collection in the United States of any unit of the National Park Service. So we have 9 lighthouse structures on 6 different islands here. And the reason they started building lighthouses is actually something that took place on the opposite end of Lake Superior from where we are. Back in the year 1855, they opened the Sault Ste. Marie Locks. Changed us forever, because opening of the locks allowed boat traffic to come between the lower Great Lakes and Lake Superior, which meant it could bring people and goods, and we could take things from our area and move it to the lower Great Lakes as well. When the boats started traversing, starting in 1855, it started to bring people here. Bayfield, Wisconsin, founded 1 year later, 1856. And when you've got boat traffic, well, what do you have to have? Lighthouses. And so it ended up where gradually through the next number of decades, a number of different lighthouses were built here on the Apostles to guide ships through these Apostle Islands.
What was the first lighthouse built there, Fred?
That was good old Michigan Island. Michigan Island was built in 1857. Unique story, and if you don't mind, I'm just going to digress a minute and just talk about it because it's such a funny story about what happened.
Go ahead. That's why we have you on.
All right. All right. The government decided that they needed a lighthouse. The lighthouse was going to be called the La Pointe Lighthouse. Well, La Pointe is a small village on the island of Madeline, just outside of Bayfield here. And they wanted to light the entrance to those communities. And so they set aside money to build this lighthouse. They hired a company from Milwaukee, Wisconsin to come all the way up here to build that first lighthouse. Well, that company got here, and they thought they were speaking with a true government official, and whoever it was directed them out to build that lighthouse on Michigan Island. Well, Michigan Island is nowhere near the village of La Pointe or Madeline Island. It's an island or two away. And so here they construct this lighthouse on that island. And they actually opened it. They had a keeper. They hired a keeper. The keeper was there. And the government sent inspectors to inspect this brand new lighthouse because they had to approve of it before they paid the company that did the work out there. Well, the inspector was directed all the way out to Michigan Island. He said, wait a minute, that's not where the lighthouse was supposed to be built. They ended up talking with the company and said, we're not going to pay you for this. You built it in the wrong location. And so they said, before we pay you, you have to build it on the correct location, which was going to be Long Island, and so that the light could shine that entrance into places like the village of La Pointe and also the village of Bayfield here. And so that poor company built 2 lighthouses, our first and second lighthouses, but we only paid for one of those lighthouses. Well, good old Michigan was only left open 1 year. And they decided, no, we didn't really need a lighthouse way out there. But you know what? As time went on, 10 years later, they had then rethought their decision and reopened Michigan in the 1860s, and it was open ever since that time. We still have a light there today, and so things change as time goes on.
Yes.
But I, what's interesting about that Michigan lighthouse, because really, Fred, I think that's the only place I've been where you can look down on a lighthouse because there are 2, like right next to each other. What's that all about?
That's another whole story, too. So the first lighthouse was not a real tall lighthouse. It wasn't needed at that time. But as that shipping changed, they felt they needed a taller tower there. And so they actually found a lighthouse that was no longer being used. It was a lighthouse on Schooner's Ledge out in the Delaware River, if you can imagine that. And in 1919, they moved that 112-foot tower, took it apart, disassembled it, and transported it all the way to Michigan Island. It sat in pieces, not for 6 months, not for a year. It sat in pieces for 10 years. Until 1929, when they finally seemed to have the money to to construct that second tower. That's the tallest of any of our lighthouse towers here in the Apostles. And then they were able to electrify, because by then they had the ability to have an electric light at the top of the tower, and they didn't have to rely on other fuel sources. And so, yes, you can climb that beautiful tower even today, and you can look down and take a picture of a lighthouse below you, a second lighthouse. So that's why Michigan has two right next together lighthouses.
We're talking with Fred Schlichting today. He's National Park Ranger with the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. In particular, talking a lot about this lighthouse history. Fred, you're touching on these lighthouses being built, and they're being, with companies traveling in and everything. We're talking about building these houses in an era where we certainly didn't have the modern technology that we have now with power tools and power boats and all of that. How were these lighthouses built? What kinds of materials, the designing, the cost, all of that? How did that all work to get these made back then?
Well, back in those days, the Bureau of Lighthouses had a series of architects that designed what they called stock plans for lighthouses. They didn't even know where they were going to be placed. Mm-hmm. Well, then once they had a location for a lighthouse, they would go out and inspect and take a look at that site and say, well, which one of these plans makes sense for us? So just for an example, we have a lighthouse called Sand Island Lighthouse. Beautiful building. Well, if you go up to Michigan's Copper Country up there, you're going to see a couple lighthouses there that look just like the one over on Sand Island. Mm-hmm. Good example, because they reuse those plans over and over and over again. So they had the stock designs for those, and they would match them to the site depending on the particular location. They would try to use, where they could, local materials. And so on Sand Island here in the Apostles, that particular lighthouse is made out of brownstone that was quarried right here on our islands. And other places, they used wood. It just depended on what they were able to bring to a site and what the designs were, if they had materials readily at hand for that. Each of these lighthouses was approved by Congress, if you can imagine that. At those days, every single lighthouse had to be approved by Congress, and it was given a budget, and they had to stay within that particular budget to build that particular site.
And then, Fred, they had to find keepers. So you built it, but was that an easy job to fill? Because, this is way before their social media, internet, carrier pigeons probably were their most reliable source of information. How did they find the folks to live there?
Well, they did try to find locals. Sometimes, once the lighthouse service was well established, people would move between different sites because you moved up north. You always started as an assistant keeper, sometimes as a second assistant. Work a few years. You work your way up to first assistant, work a few more years, you work your way up to head keeper. They were looking for people with skills, and if you can imagine, even 100 and some years ago, 150 years ago, they did a test of reading and writing, basic skills to become a lighthouse keeper. So you had to have certain basic skills. If you had a steam generation system for the steam whistles, you wanted somebody who knew how to operate steam engines. So you looked for those types of skills. I want to share with you, though, a story. And this story is the first keeper at Raspberry Island. This lighthouse keeper, his name was Andrew Kramer. And Raspberry opened in the year 1863. And they advertised locally for someone to fill that position. There was this Andrew Kramer who lived on Madeline Island. And at the time, Madeline Island was the hopping spot back in the 1860s. It was a fairly decent-sized community on Madeline Island. And he applied for that position. He got it. And they transported him all the way out to Raspberry Island. He arrived there. And he opened the lighthouse and lit the light. And after a couple of weeks, he thought, whoa, this isn't for me. I want to be with my friends. I don't want to be stuck out here on an island. So here's the smart guy who goes back to Madeline Island. He started talking around, and he subcontracted his job out to a friend of his who went back to Raspberry Island and continued to tend the light. Well, about 3 months later, the inspector arrived, and this little gig didn't last any longer than then because that inspector said, "You must be Andrew Kramer." He says, "No, I'm not Andrew Kramer." And the truth be known, Andrew Kramer's sitting back over on Madeline Island. Well, good old Andrew Kramer got fired that very day, and so did the guy who was filling in. So it wasn't a job for everybody. We had, though, keepers who spent over 30 years at a lighthouse. Over on Michigan Island, Ed Lane was there for over 30 years. So it just depended on the person and whether that was a life for them.
You know, Fred, you're sharing some really interesting stories here, the people. And, you know, it's interesting because a lot of times for us, we hear about the lighthouses. We look at them as architectural examples and historic examples and what they did. But a lot of times, like for myself, I don't even, I don't think about the people that were in them. This has been real interesting so far as you're telling these stories about these people that made these work and made them happen. You've had some unique stories so far here. But I have to ask you, is there like a favorite? I mean, what I mean by that is like either a favorite lighthouse that you like to talk about or a favorite story tied to that lighthouse, because I'm sensing here from our first few minutes of this conversation, you have a few stories still left in the quiver. What are some of the good ones? I mean, everybody listening in loves this. So what would be the Fred Schlichting favorite?
All right, you asked a couple questions, so I'm going to take one question first, and then I'm going to tell you another little story here. My favorite lighthouse. I've done most of the lighthouses here. I've got to say Raspberry because that's where I work. I work on Raspberry Island. That is my favorite. However, when I do retire from this job, I'm going to volunteer, hopefully, in this park, and where I want to be placed back out at good old Devil's Island. It's such a unique island. It's way out in the lake. I know, Frida, you've been to that island.
Well, and you know, Fred, doesn't that count as the northernmost point in Wisconsin?
It does. It is. And it's got unbelievable sea caves on the north end of that island.
Beautiful.
And, if you ever can, they are fantastic. One of the nice things when you volunteer at a place like that, the park is very good about helping you get your kayak out there. I've had the chance to kayak through those caves on that northern tip there. They are absolutely spectacular. The tour boat from Bayfield goes there every day, so you do have a chance even today to see those. But the reason I like Devils so much is because of the unique vegetation that's on that island. We have one species that they've identified really only grows up in the Arctic regions, and it is sitting on that northern edge there, right on the rocky shores there. It's a little flower that grows there. So such unique vegetation. There's virtually no soil because it's all brownstone that's underneath there. It's very exposed to the winds and the waves. When you live in that lighthouse there, and you are trying to fall asleep at night, especially if the winds and the waves have picked up, you hear sounds that you wouldn't have imagined ever. Yeah. And you can then understand why the Native Americans referred to that as the island of the evil spirits, or of course we call it today Devil's Island, because there are sounds that you can't imagine that emit from those caves, from the winds and waves, especially with the water coming in and out of those caves at night. So it's a unique place.
And I have to share that last August, Walt, we were at Raspberry and we were going to stay a couple of nights with Fred because he keeps the grounds. It's just so spectacular. Right, and sunset at Raspberry is just fabulous. And he shared some of his green beans with us. And we just had such a great visit. But the next morning he looked at us. He goes, "You kids need to leave." Because there's going to be a storm. He knew it. It was a beautiful blue sky day. We were like, no, you guys need to go.
If Fred says it's coming, it's coming.
You know what? This guy knows. And then we did. And of course, the whole idea of us trying to get back to our boats, load our boats back up, it was like, whew, this is a lot of work. I wanted a day off, right? But we did get a chance because it was still calm weather and we were able to get in and out of the caves. And then we put our boats on basically the rock shore at Devil's. We made our way to Devil's. It's a long paddle. And then the storm hit.
Oh, man.
And he's absolutely right. The thunder. Fred, I remember feeling, I was standing on the ground, but I felt like there was thunder underneath me. It was amazing. Yeah. And we were stuck there, I think, for 3 days.
3 days?
Because of the storm. Yeah.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
See, you got to listen to Fred.
We
See?
made Fred's green beans last a long time. We had another meal out of them.
So that it's the sounds, it's this atmosphere and everything, but you must have like a favorite story related to one of these places. I know you're kind of starting to tell that a little bit. Share with us,
Well,
please.
I want to tell you a little bit about the job that I do and what is my job. I'm keeper at Raspberry Island, and we do a variety of different types of tours. If you were to come in your sailboat and you came up and asked for a tour, we would provide you with a tour. We'd be in park uniform, and we would tell you about the history of the lighthouse, and we do storytelling about that. The lighthouse is decorated how it looked in the 1920s, and so that's the era that we portray, and we walk you through several of the different buildings that are out there and tell you a little bit about the life of Keeper. But if you come on the tour boat, and the tour boat comes out certain days of the week during the summer, we do what's called living history, where we actually take the role of an actual lighthouse keeper from the past. And the one nice thing when you start working for the park is they let you develop and research who do you want to be.
Okay.
And during this time period, there was three main keepers. There was Lee Benton, who was the head keeper. There was a guy by the name of Toots Winfield. He was an assistant. He was kind of a crusty character. And then there was Tom Hassing, who was also an assistant keeper. I chose to pick Tom because nobody's ever done him before. And so the park has great historical research on all the different people who worked in our park. And so you learn about what the life was like. You've got to really learn about the time period. And then you actually portray. You dress as the keeper when the people arrive, and you take them back in time. And the year that we portray right now is 1923. That's 99 years ago. And there's some specific things that happened on that island that year that we talk about, and we try to make the people feel like they're actually back in time. Hence, Frida mentioned that she ate some of our green beans. We have a vegetable garden there. We have flower gardens. And we have all of those things to make you feel like you truly are back in time. And so that's a unique piece for us. That's a little bit about what we do there.
That's what's interesting to me. Like I said a moment ago, it's like you tell the stories of the people that are there, which is so much more than just the facilities. We're talking with Fred Schlichting here today on the podcast. He's a National Park Ranger at Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, really talking about the history of the lighthouses there at the Apostles. And Frida has a note here a little bit, Fred, and I have to ask about this. Francis Jacker and Yacker.
You know, Walt and Francis Yacker, when he retired from being a lighthouse keeper, he moved to your house. Almost.
My house.
He moved to Chassel.
He did?
Yes.
I'm from Chassel.
I know. He's in the Chassel Historical Society. There. Well, anyway,
now I got to look this up when I got some time off.
Well,
look at that.
Fred's got to tell you the story about Francis.
Yes, tell us about Francis.
Well, Francis was a lighthouse keeper here in the 1880s and early 1890s. Francis was married. His wife was Native American. And what makes Francis quite unusual, he had a couple of unusual things before I even tell you that story. He was an artist, and he did etchings and pieces of shelf fungus. He sold them, if you can imagine, way back in the 1880s. He built globes. He was just quite a unique man. He also took a great interest in the Native American culture, and he not only learned to speak Ojibwe, he actually learned to write the Ojibwe language, which is very unusual at that time for a white person to take interest in that.
Right.
So he was kind of a very interesting man. The story I want to tell you took place in the fall of 1887. Mr. Yacker, his family wasn't here that particular day. It was in September, and it was starting to get cold. And the family was back in Bayfield for a period of time. And Mr. Yacker tended the light like he always did. He went up to the top of the tower, lit the light that night, and made sure everything was in order. He started to dress for bed, and he put his night gown on, and he was getting ready to go to bed. And he noticed that the winds were changing, and the winds were picking up, and the waves were picking up. And all of a sudden he remembered, oh my gosh, the little sailboat that belonged to the federal government that he was responsible for was sitting at the dock right in front of the lighthouse. He had not taken it over to the boathouse, which is about 3/4 of a mile away around the side of the island. And he thought, if this picks up any further, that boat's going to be torn to bits sitting where it is, the way the winds were coming in.
Right.
So he got down and he quickly ran down to that boat in his nightwear, and he had no shoes on, if you can imagine this. And he got into that boat, and he was going to sail it around to the side of the island there, and he was going to walk the trail back. That's a 3/4 mile walk back to the lighthouse. So he gets in the boat and starts off. By then, the winds and waves had really picked up, and he was concerned about it. Well, he got around part of the side of the island, and that wind was pushing him towards shore, and he got a little too close to shore. He tore up his centerboard, and so that meant he had no way to steer that boat. And he started to take on water. He was in trouble, and he got that sail up, but he was at the mercy of pretty much wherever the lake was going to take them. Well, he didn't end up on Raspberry Island. He ended up on our neighboring island about 4 miles away, which is Oak Island. Not only was he on Oak Island, he was on the north side of Oak Island, which meant he wasn't in the shipping channel. Who was going to see him? Well, Francis still wasn't that worried. He decided that he was going to sleep in his boat there overnight, and he would get up in the morning, and he was going to flag down the boats that might pass him on the north end of Oak Island. He got up the next morning. There were no boats to be seen.
Of course.
He couldn't see anything. There was nothing. He was very lucky. He survived, but it wasn't on his doing. It was his wife.
Yeah.
Well, how could that be? She was back in Bayfield. No, she wasn't. The day after the storm, she got a ride from one of the ships that was going west, all the way out to Raspberry Island. She walked up those steps up to the top of the lighthouse grounds, and she calls out for Francis. Of course, you already know he's not there. There was no Francis there. She sent her son down to walk the trail down to the other end of the island to see if he was at the boathouse. Not only was he not at the boathouse, his boat was gone. She went down frantically to that dock, and she sat there and tried to flag down some of the boats. It was a busy channel back in those days, so boats passed. And she put word out that her husband was missing. They tried to light the nights that he was gone, but not to very much success. He ended up being rescued by a Native American person who was fishing on that north end of the island. It was on the third day that he had been gone. And he was successfully brought back to Raspberry Island. So he did survive that. Now, you might wonder, how does Ranger Fred know all of these details about this particular story? Well, one thing that keepers had to do is they had to write every single day in the logbook what they had done and what had happened at their site. Well, he wrote about it, 3 sentences. I think I talked more than that. So, well, here's the rest of the story. He got in trouble because one of the boats that passed the night of the storm was looking for the Raspberry Island light, and of course it was unlit because it ran out of oil. And so he got in trouble because that captain wrote to the lighthouse service, and they started an investigation about this derelict lighthouse keeper who left his light unattended on the night of a storm. And so there was an investigation. He almost got fired. But the interesting thing is, not only did he keep his job, they awarded him a second keeper or assistant keeper there because he, so that light would never be left unattended if you were taken away from your duties. One more piece, back where you're from there, Walt. His diary is there in that museum. And it tells a much more complete story than he put in his logbook. It tells exactly this whole story that I just told you.
We're talking with Fred Schlichting on our podcast, Lake Superior Podcast today. He's a National Park Ranger with the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. And, Fred, I have to say that's just a very interesting little personal connection there for me. But for people that maybe want to come and experience this, maybe they want to come and do a tour or something, how do people, because just listening to you makes you want to go there and hear you tell these stories and the other folks and do this. What's the best way? What kind of suggestions do you have for people to come and experience these with tours that are available?
Well, our concessionaire is Apostle Island Cruises, and they during the summer season, they'll be starting June 18th, and every Tuesday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, they do trips out to Raspberry Island. You have about 2 hours out of the island. We do our living history for those particular tours, and so that's the easiest way to come out here to see us. If you're a kayaker, or if you're a sailboater or a power boater, you can bring your boat out. We have a dock there. We also have other areas for kayakers to leave their kayaks, and we'll be glad to give you a tour anytime you come out. Let's say you're a person who can't get out to see our island. Well, we have one more way. If you go to our park's website, you'll see a virtual area that's on our main page of the website, and you can take a virtual tour of Raspberry Island. It's narrated by me, and we do a little storytelling with that, too. We walk you through the lighthouse, and you'll see pictures of every single room that's in that, and you'll learn a little bit about that particular light station.
It's such good news, Fred, that now we can get back to the tours. And have you already been out to Raspberry? How's it looking this summer?
Oh, I was actually out there yesterday, and I was so excited because we got to start setting up for the season, and this will be back to normal. It's been 2 years of not normal, and so I'm very much looking forward. I have a new partner this year. His name is Dave Von Hoff, and he will be the second ranger out there, and I'll even have volunteers out there working with me, and so we are looking forward to being back to normal this year.
Fred, it's been really a great time having you on the podcast today. I do have to say this, that I can tell just from the passion, but also the component of being an educator. You like to share the stories and you like to teach, and it's been really wonderful having you take us on these little journeys here over this last half hour or so. And we do want to thank you really so much for your time today, because you've made it, you're going to have people from around the world that want to come to the Apostles now and experience this, Fred. This has been great.
Fred, can we do a little list of the lighthouses that you could go and visit? So Sand Island is probably pretty close for folks leaving right out of the
Little Sand Bay.
Yes, yep. Right.
You can get to Sand Island. We do have a volunteer on that island, and it is open most days of the week, and that schedule is yet to be determined. That lighthouse, you can go through the house, but it is in pretty bad shape on the inside, but they at least let you in the doors, and I believe you can still climb the tower there. Michigan Island will be open this year, and that will be with volunteers, and you can go up into the new tower, the newer tower, I guess I would call it, and also you are allowed to go through the old lighthouse as well, and they have exhibits there that tell the stories about that particular, the keepers that were there, and some of the other major things about that particular lighthouse there. Devil's Island will remain closed right now. A few years ago, when we had major storms here, the dock washed away, and so I think it'll be a couple more years before Michigan or before Devil's Island will reopen. The other lighthouses are not open regularly.
Okay, and just to let folks know, it's a pretty good little hike over to the Sand Island Lighthouse. I think it's maybe about 1.5 miles from the dock. And then to get to Raspberry, if you go at the kayak landing, it's another maybe 1.5 miles, is it? It was
3/4 of a mile
only
from the kayak
3/4.
landing.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm. It was all that gear we had to haul that made it feel like it was 11 miles.
10 miles, right?
Right. And then if you go to Michigan, it's not a long hike, but it's a lot of stairs to get to Michigan. So, folks just have footwear that you're going to hike in.
Well, and it drives home the point, Fred, that these are all built on some very, rocky outcropping island type areas, and that's why it's going to be a little challenging, but it can certainly be worth it. And you've made it very interesting and appealing to us today, Fred. Again, thanks for your time today. And is there anything you'd like to add here before we wrap up with you today?
No, it's a pleasure to talk to you, and I would love to have visitors come out and see me. Tell me you saw the or you listened to the podcast, and we'll give you a grand tour out there.
Absolutely. Fred, thank you so much for your time, all right?
Oh, thank you, friend.
All right. Have a good one.
That's Fred Schlichting. He is National Park Ranger at the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. Frida, this is a little over a half hour that we talked to Fred, and it just flew by because it's not just the stories, but how he likes to tell them.
Oh, Walt, when I met him last August, I said, I know we've got to talk with him. And what a great opening for the tourism season this year. He's already been out to the island. Things are looking good. He said there were a few branches down on the trail, but you can always expect that. But if you can only make it to one of the lighthouses, go meet Fred. Go and hear his tour, the passion that he has. You're absolutely right. And of course, he lives right there in Cornucopia, so he's looking out at the lake all the time, and he's got a great weather sense.
It is just something for me, as you know, as you mentioned that with Francis and the story about him and the tie to Chassel and everything, and that's my hometown in Chassel in the Copper Country in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and this is something that it's interesting because as somebody that's grown up with this. What I'm learning through this particular episode of the podcast and other ones that you and I have done over these couple of seasons is that I'm starting to feel like the New Yorker who never went to go see the Statue of Liberty. And hopefully our conversations are encouraging you out there who are joining us to look into these national parks along Lake Superior and look into the Great Lakes and look into protecting our Great Lakes, because this has really been a wonderful experience putting these together, and we have many more to come. But Fred was fantastic today.
Yep. And that Francis Yocker story, the mushrooms or the lichen or whatever it was that he was using to carve because he was an artist, they were found in Europe. And his globe is at the Chassel Historical Museum. And that's how we kind of had that link. When he retired from lighthouse keeping, he went and lived on the canal.
I guess I better go and take a look at that the next time I'm home.
Married to a Native American?
I know. It's a very interesting little story there. But that's going to wrap it up for this particular episode of our podcast, the Lake Superior Podcast. We hope you've enjoyed listening to it as much as we, Frida and I, have had bringing it to you here today. And we do thank again Fred Schlichting, a National Park Ranger at the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. And look into the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation to find out more about all of these national parks and how you can get involved. I'm Walt Lindala.
I'm Frida Waara. Thanks so much for listening. The National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation, NPLSF, is the only official nonprofit 501c3 fundraising partner of the National Park Service for all 5 U.S. national park sites on Lake Superior.
To learn more about NPLSF projects and programs, you can visit the website at nplsf.org or friend them on Facebook.
I'm Frida Waara.
And I'm Walt Lindala. Thanks for listening to the Lake Superior Podcast.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?
And sponsored by Uber Creative Agency, a boutique web design, development, and marketing agency based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with clients across the U.S. We don't just provide services, we deliver value.